When Journey to Atlantis opened its doors in 1998 at SeaWorld Orlando, it brought with it a major step forward for the park. An incredibly innovative new design, part dark ride, part water ride, and part roller coaster, taking guests on an exciting voyage to the mythical underwater city. A ride SeaWorld hoped could stand up against the huge new attractions arriving at nearby Disney and Universal. But despite how well conceived it may have been, Journey to Atlantis also brought with it a lot of problems. Loved by some, but criticized by others for being messy, confusing, and also unexpectedly scary, and a ride that very quickly fell into disrepair, spending years with broken effects, their number only increasing as time went on, eventually resulting in large parts of the ride just being removed entirely. Today, a neglected relic of SeaWorld's past ambitions. I want to take a look back at the history of Journey to Atlantis, a sad but very interesting story of when SeaWorld tried to build its own big-budget dark ride, the issues it faced, what made it so scary, the embarrassing cutbacks to its sister attractions, and the current state of SeaWorld's broken water ride. In the 1990s, major change was taking shape at SeaWorld Orlando. The park had opened in 1973 to the southwest of Orlando, Florida, under the name SeaWorld of Florida, the third SeaWorld park to open, following the original in San Diego, California, and a park in Ohio. A marine life park, containing mainly aquarium-like exhibits and shows featuring dolphins, seals, and of course, the park's killer attraction, a performance from the world's most famous orca, Shamu. One of the first major tourist spots to open in Central Florida since the 1971 arrival of Walt Disney World. SeaWorld had spent the 70s and 80s operating as a laid-back day out in the heart of America's emerging theme park capital. And built literally just up the road from Disney, it had grown accustomed to welcoming the excess Disney crowds looking for things to do beyond the vacation kingdom. But now, quickly approaching its third decade, SeaWorld looked like it was starting to falter. By the beginning of the 90s, not only had Disney World grown into a 3-theme park resort, but Universal Studios had just opened, along the same stretch of highway as SeaWorld. And all of these parks were now busy opening new, high-budget, highly themed dark rides, thrill rides, and modern motion simulators. A new landscape of Florida theme park attractions for a new generation of theme park guests. SeaWorld, by comparison, had nothing. The entire SeaWorld company had recently been acquired by brewing company Anheuser-Busch, also the operator of the Busch Gardens parks, and the new owners were worried that its quiet marine life identity would no longer be able to bring in the tourists when faced with the massive new theme parks that were right next door. And so, with the hopes of bringing the park into the modern age, they decided that it too would need to open its own highly themed, big-budget rides and attractions, transitioning SeaWorld of Florida from a marine park into a high-quality, modern theme park. In 1992, SeaWorld of Florida would open its first attempt at a modern 90s theme park attraction, Mission Bermuda Triangle, a motion simulator, taking guests on an exciting and dangerous voyage aboard a submarine in the Bermuda Triangle. A similar idea to Disney's Star Tours and Body Wars attractions, both recent hits in their respective parks, and a good choice of theme for SeaWorld, maintaining the familiar ocean setting. 3 years later, in 1995, Mission Bermuda Triangle would reopen as Wild Arctic, a similar journey now to the Arctic Circle, also adding themed indoor sets to the attraction's exit. Both versions of the simulator had been successful additions, but the park, by this point being referred to by its modern name SeaWorld Orlando, wanted bigger. What's more, as the late 90s were approaching, the major players in Central Florida were both set to open new theme parks with even more detailed themed attractions, many promising journeys to fantastical, mysterious worlds. Before they'd even caught up, it looked like SeaWorld were going to fall behind again. And so, eager to further transform itself into a modern theme park, SeaWorld Orlando would respond by developing its largest, most expensive attraction yet. The new attraction would be a boat ride, themed to a trip to the lost city of Atlantis, the mythological civilization of ancient Greek origin, said to have sunk beneath the Atlantic Ocean. Atlantis was the perfect choice for SeaWorld, once again sticking to the ocean setting, while allowing it to expand its offerings into the realm of fantasy. Guests were to visit ancient ruins and uncover hidden wonders in highly decorated show scenes. But to give the ride an edge over its competitors, it wouldn't just be a simple boat ride. Instead, it would be the first ever implementation of a new ride system developed by Mack Rides named the Water Coaster, a combination of a boat ride and a roller coaster. The ride vehicles would be able to freely float along like in a typical boat ride, but at certain points they could attach themselves to a coaster track, allowing them to jump out of the water and make banked turns like on a roller coaster. The idea of adding tracks to a log flume to allow it to go up as well as down had been experimented with before on a handful of attractions around the world, but SeaWorld's new ride would easily be the most sophisticated. Set to feature a large banked S-turn in its finale, in addition to the more typical flume-style drops. The part dark ride, part flume ride, part roller coaster would be built on a 6-acre expansion to SeaWorld Orlando, near the park's penguin exhibits. I couldn't find a definitive source for this, but on the website of one of the ride's designers, he seems to suggest that it cost around $40 million to build. This budget actually wouldn't bring it close to similar water rides at Disney and Universal, like 1992's Splash Mountain, but it would still be a massive amount of money for the park's first ever major ride. The ride would also incorporate cutting-edge special effects, like video screens, fiber optic lights, and late 90s CGI, then just called CGI. And on April 17th, 1998, just 5 days before Disney World would open their fourth theme park, Animal Kingdom, SeaWorld would open their trip beneath the ocean, named Journey to Atlantis. To draw attention to its new, thrill-focused identity, the park would change its name to SeaWorld Adventure Park, and upon arrival, guests could make their way to the very back of the park, where they'd be met with the imposing building housing Journey to Atlantis, a 10-story, sprawling sandstone temple deliberately designed to frame its centerpiece, the 60-foot flume drop, sending boats out into a lagoon in front of the building. In keeping with the origins of the myth, the story of Journey to Atlantis would begin in Greece, in a small fishing village on the island of Thera. In the queue, guests would journey through the village, adorned with artifacts of the local industry, mainly a large amount of sponges hanging on the walls. Near the beginning of the queue, they'd also pass a news van, and above their heads, TVs would play a compilation of news reports detailing how the small island had become overrun with scientists and journalists, after a local fisherman accidentally discovered the lost city of Atlantis off the island's coast. Guests would learn how the eccentric fisherman, named Stavros, had found a magical seahorse, which, after touching it, had transported him to Atlantis. However, Stavros would warn the public not to attempt to reach the city, and the collection of news reports would suggest that there was something dangerous lurking within Atlantis that might be set loose. Within the story of the ride, guests would play a role not too dissimilar to real life, as oblivious tourists, ignoring Stavros' warning and pushing forward to see the sunken city as they began the ride. Although I have read that potentially guests were playing the role of reporters trying to uncover the city, as one comment from a former ride operator on Reddit claims that in the early years, ride operators would be dressed as reporters. Unlike a lot of stuff from Disney and Universal from the time, aside from a short segment on a TV special, footage of Journey to Atlantis when it was brand new is quite hard to come by. So I'm going to have to use a variety of older and newer footage in this segment to explain the ride. The ride vehicle would be an 8-person boat, with 4 rows of 2 seats each. The initial part of the ride would contain most of the dark ride elements, and guests would first arrive in the village harbour on Thera, their final stop as they embarked on a nighttime journey to Atlantis. Before they left, a door of one of the houses would fling open, and a screen behind it would show Stavros, calling to them that before they ventured any further, they must let the magical seahorse, named Hermes, lead the way. Hermes would then transform into a stream of golden lights and travel across the ceiling ahead of the boat, an effect achieved through thousands of fiber optic lights placed throughout the ride. Periodically, Hermes would materialize along the route as an animatronic. The boat would then travel through a tunnel of stars, representing their transition underwater. And in the next scene, guests would go past colourful coral reefs lit by black lights, as Hermes guided them onwards. Deeper into the reefs, another screen effect would show a statue of a mermaid come to life, a character named Allura, who would welcome guests and beckon them to come closer to witness the splendour of the city of Atlantis. Allura would follow the boat, suspiciously attempting to lead guests off path, as Hermes tried to guide them to safety. Her face would appear on another statue via a screen projection, and as they passed it, guests would finally arrive in Atlantis. Another impressive show scene of ancient Greek buildings. Water jets would fly over the boat, and Hermes would pop up in the middle of a fountain in the city. After visiting the city, it would then be time for the boat to journey home. However, before it could leave, Allura would appear again as a projection in another fountain. She was no longer playful, and would scold Hermes for not allowing her to get closer to the guests. As they passed, her face would distort into the demonic siren that she secretly was, and turning the corner, a flash of light would suddenly reveal Allura's true form, and a large figure would lunge towards guests from above, her eyes glowing green as she tried to trap the guests in Atlantis. One of the most effective jump scares in a theme park attraction. The boat would then ascend up a lift hill, and Allura's green eyes would appear again. Then the ride would transition into the outdoor flume ride section, as guests attempted to escape from the siren. The boat would ascend even further up the building, as, bizarrely, the theme from the movie Beetlejuice would play. Especially strange considering that was a character who appeared at nearby Universal Studios. I couldn't find any explanation as to why this music plays on the ride. I guess SeaWorld just liked it. Upon reaching the top of the building, guests would then plummet down the ride's 60-foot drop into the lagoon below, and make a turn back towards the show building. A climactic final drop like this would typically be where a flume ride would end, and most guests would reasonably assume this was the end of the ride. However, as the boat went down another much smaller drop, Allura's voice would appear again, and the boat would ascend up another lift hill to travel back inside the building. Here, guests would find the ride's final show scene, a lair where Allura had gathered treasures and shipwrecks from past visitors. Before they become Allura's next victims, the boat would plunge into complete darkness as the ride would enter its real finale, the water coaster section, hurtling through an S-curve, which would empty out into one final splashdown in a hidden lagoon around the back of the show building. Having successfully escaped the grip of Allura, the boat would then arrive in the unload station to end the ride. The original version of Journey to Atlantis was an incredibly ambitious attempt to appeal to the modern theme park audience, and it was a significant step up for SeaWorld, considering the only ride of any sort they had previously built was a motion simulator. A hybrid of a dark ride, thrill ride, and water ride meant SeaWorld was really throwing themselves in at the deep end. The ride was a really well-conceived idea with a lot of effort put into its theming. The decision to create in-universe video segments in the queue was clearly inspired by the likes of Jaws at Universal. The way the ride experience itself subverted the expectations for a typical flume ride with its hidden water coaster segment was a genuinely surprising moment, and a fun and creative approach to the concept of theme park expectations. And being the first time a ride system like this had been implemented on this scale, SeaWorld were able to provide an experience neither of their big competitors in Central Florida had. Beyond the ride system itself, those special effects all achieved the modern approach SeaWorld was aiming for. However, Journey to Atlantis did still have a lot of difficulty winning over some visitors when it first opened. Of course, with a much lower budget than Disney and Universal, there were always going to be a greater number of limitations. One of the problems the attraction had was that its storytelling was incredibly difficult to follow. The ride story that I've just recounted might seem pretty straightforward, but that came from watching multiple ride-throughs again and again, and from one extremely helpful write-up in particular from when the attraction first opened. While it was easy to understand the basic premise of Journey to Atlantis, a lot of the smaller details of the story were told through special effects that were very easy to miss, mainly in the case of Hermes, who was only a small animated figure that would appear and disappear quickly, making it a little hard for the average guest to realize that it was him leading them through the attraction. Some of Allura's voice lines could often be drowned out by the general sounds of the attraction, and a major part of the backstory, Stavros warning people to stay away from Atlantis, is mentioned only once, very briefly in the Q video. A segment which, all in all, feels a little disjointed, like it's trying to condense too many different threads into as short a time span as possible. Those issues with the story, though, were pretty minor. It was engaging enough, and the special effects and the thrill elements of the ride made up for any of its roughness. The bigger criticism for Journey to Atlantis when it first opened was that the ride was surprisingly scary. The opening scenes had a creepy vibe to them already, but the moment that Allura revealed her true intentions, followed by a jump scare from a gigantic model of her suddenly appearing above the ride boat, was a completely unexpected and pretty terrifying moment. The ride did very little to let guests know how dark it was going to be, from the outside presenting itself as a family-friendly boat ride, with only, again, those very subtle suggestions in the Q video giving any hint at what lies in store. And with its low height requirement, a lot of families with young children boarded Journey to Atlantis completely unaware of just how intense it was going to be. I'm speaking from experience here, as I rode Journey to Atlantis for the first time when I was 6, and to say I was blindsided by this attraction would be an understatement. Many families complained that the ride was too intense for the park. That fantastic way that Journey to Atlantis subverted expectations ended up also harming its reputation. Overall, Journey to Atlantis' initial reception was mixed. The messy storytelling and the scary moments were big points of criticism, with many comparing it unfavourably to Splash Mountain. But others loved the water coaster elements, viewing it as a major win for SeaWorld. It hadn't quite brought the park to the level of its competitors, but it was a step in the right direction. All they needed to do now was keep this up, and perhaps have another go at a new ride with slightly more budget. Unfortunately, as Journey to Atlantis settled into operation in Orlando, SeaWorld would almost immediately allow it to decline, and the park's hopes of growing to the size of Disney and Universal would start to sink beneath the waves. In the year 2000, SeaWorld Orlando would add its next major ride, a B&M floorless roller coaster named Kraken, built next door to Journey to Atlantis. The roller coaster was loosely themed to the mythical sea monster of the same name. A good ride, but nowhere near as story-heavy or as detailed as the 1998 water ride, beginning a slight departure from the focus on story-based rides. And around that year, SeaWorld would make the first changes to Journey to Atlantis, as the news coverage was removed from the overhead TVs and replaced with a safety video featuring a mime. The news van was also removed around this time. It was said by guests in the late 90s that the news reports were very difficult to hear anyway, so this might not have made a huge difference. But their removal now cut out an entire element of the story, and made it even harder for guests to understand what was going on, and they would no longer have any way of knowing the relevance of either of the two characters. Stavros was now just an unnamed character of no particular importance, who handed you Hermes with very little explanation. 2004 would bring the next step for the Sunken City, as a second version of Journey to Atlantis would open at the original SeaWorld park in San Diego. Some were hopeful that this newer version would fix a lot of the problems of its predecessor, mainly improving its story. But as it would turn out, the San Diego version of the ride would do the exact opposite. The ride system would remain the same, but rather than fixing the story, it instead just cut the entire dark ride section, placing the track outside, replacing the imposing Atlantic temple with 2 towers for the drops. All of the characters would be cut, and only minimal narration would stay behind, talking more generally about Atlantis. One new addition would be that instead of going up a second lift hill for the finale roller coaster section, the boat would travel up an elevator. And the San Diego version would technically fix the problem of the ride being too scary, but it only achieved this by cost cutting, not by adding something better, marking a major downgrade from the ambitious, albeit misguided Orlando attraction. In 2007, a third version of Journey to Atlantis would open at SeaWorld San Antonio, the fourth SeaWorld park which had opened in 1988. The theming was even more cut back, and the ride was no longer the same water coaster. Instead, a different Mack ride design named the Super Splash, a ride that would take guests up a lift hill, where a 360 turntable would spin them around, giving them a scenic view over, the parking lot, I guess, then drop them backwards through a dip to another 360 turntable, which would reorient them and send them down the ride's only drop. As the stripped back versions of the ride operated into the late 2000s, back in Florida, the original Journey to Atlantis experienced a continued decline of its story elements, now exacerbated by emerging technical issues. By the early 2010s, a little over a decade after it first opened, many of the special effects on Journey to Atlantis were either no longer working properly or completely switched off. Several mist and fog effects hadn't worked since the early days of the attraction, such as a moment in the finale involving a second projection of Allura's face. But now, a lot of the bigger effects, including several of the animatronics, were regularly breaking down. Some of the Hermes animatronics would get stuck, and occasionally the large Allura animatronic wouldn't move, with the jump scare moment being achieved through lighting effects alone. Forum posts online from around 2011 onwards frequently described the ride as being broken, and as the decade continued, the broken effects would go from an occasional mishap to a pretty consistent part of the ride experience. Even if the animatronics and other moving effects were operational, they would also suffer another problem, as they'd often fall out of sync with the ride vehicle, either deploying before the boat had arrived in a scene, or just after it had left. By 2015, audio tracks would regularly cut out, or sometimes just not play. And importantly, with how easy it was to miss some of these moments to begin with, this made the ride's story even more confusing and even more difficult to follow. In the very first scene of the ride, very occasionally, the door that swung open to reveal Stavros wouldn't open, causing guests to skip the entire explanation of how Hermes was guiding them through Atlantis in the first place. That is mostly anecdotal, as I personally have memories of this happening, but even when it did open, the poor synchronization on the ride would cause the boat to move off into the next scene before the effect had fully played out, meaning guests often wouldn't spot the fibre optic lights representing Hermes flying above them. If, of course, those fibre optic lights worked too, which they sometimes didn't. The projection of Allura's face in the statue wouldn't show up, and the water jet wouldn't then fire, but the statue would still be lit, drawing your attention to a blank statue for no reason. Hermes no longer appeared out of the fountain, instead being locked in place as if he was just part of the fountain itself. And Allura's face appearing as she turns into the monster, the most important plot points, would regularly have no audio whatsoever. In ride-throughs from this time, you can see guests watching this projection clearly confused at what's supposed to be happening. It's actually extremely common for ride special effects to break down and go years switched off or in a lesser state of operation. Theme park fans often call this B mode, and it's most famously seen in the subject of one of my very first theme park history videos ever, the Yeti from Disney's Expedition Everest. But in most cases, a ride may have one or two broken effects. For Journey to Atlantis, it was nearly all of them. The issue with the effects exaggerated how dated the ride was now starting to feel. The basic ride system itself still worked, which did a lot to keep the attraction somewhat popular, as did the fact that SeaWorld still didn't have a huge number of standard theme park rides. But it was clear that the ride was now a far cry from what it had originally set out to be, and that something would need to change soon. In early 2017, Journey to Atlantis closed for a major refurbishment, and many fans were hopeful that this meant the ride would have its effects fully restored, fixing the nearly 20-year decline. However, when it reopened in late March, riders were met with the exact opposite of what they had expected. Not only had the effects not been fixed, but SeaWorld had completely cut the story from the ride. Some of the basic effects, like the water jets and the fibre optic lights, did actually remain, and were now more consistent. But the appearances of Stavros and Allura were both completely removed. In the first scene, the boat would arrive in the village, and then just move on, with no indication of why it was even there. The remaining scenes only featured background music, as the boat went through still nicely decorated, but static sets, and the large animatronic of Allura that once lunged out, creating the ride's scariest moment, was just left in darkness, hanging over the boat, an abandoned part of the ride. The 2017 changes were extremely disappointing, but a little expected. The technical issues had persisted for so long, just cutting the story altogether was the simplest way to deal with what was probably a very complicated and expensive issue to fix. Additionally, by the late 2010s, SeaWorld had pretty firmly abandoned its desire to compete in the themed entertainment space against Disney and Universal, more or less beginning and ending that pursuit with Journey to Atlantis, opting to focus on building more large roller coasters with lighter theming, in the vein of a park like Six Flags. And so the removal of the story didn't really matter in terms of the general feel of the park. It had technically addressed the complaints that the ride was too intense for young kids. Kind of. Today, Journey to Atlantis still operates at SeaWorld Orlando in its reduced state, a reminder of the park's once ambitious project. Since 2017, the ride has actually received some minor updates, mainly that Allura no longer hides in darkness, but is lit up once again, although she still doesn't move. The original Journey to Atlantis was a really solid attempt at themed ride design. It was a super innovative attraction for the era, and it's just a shame that SeaWorld never tried to build anything more beyond it. At opening, it did have issues with its story being unclear, and having a bit of a reliance on blink and you'll miss it moments, but the main issue with it over its entire lifespan was SeaWorld allowing it to fall apart, which then exacerbated all of those initial problems. The frustration with Journey to Atlantis is that SeaWorld basically gave up immediately when it didn't skyrocket them into success. It's perfectly okay for the park to want to pivot their strategy towards building more roller coasters. And the rides that came after this, like Kraken and Manta, were good additions to the park. But that shouldn't come at the expense of leaving an operating attraction in a state of willful neglect. Oddly enough, SeaWorld does seem to want to return to some element of themed, story-based attractions. For some reason, in 2025, the San Diego version of Journey to Atlantis was refurbished to add more story than it previously had, adding some small sets to the queue, some new narration, and some different projections in the elevator. Although many guests claim it's actually a downgrade to the version San Diego had before. And for 2026, SeaWorld Orlando is set to open an indoor suspended dark ride named SeaQuest Legends of the Deep. But given what happened to the last major themed ride it tried to build, it's difficult to tell what sort of attraction this will be, and how long it will stick around for in its original state. Did you ever ride Journey to Atlantis in its pre- or post-refurbishment states? What did you think of it? And what do you think should happen to the ride today? Let me know in the comments. There's much more that could be said about SeaWorld's direction as a whole that was a little hard to fit concisely into the end here, and perhaps I'll do a video about the park more broadly in the future. But for now, I hope you enjoyed that look back at SeaWorld's scary, neglected water ride. Thank you so much to my members on Patreon for supporting what I do here on YouTube. If you haven't heard about it yet, I started a Patreon a few months ago to provide additional exclusive videos every month. The most recent one was on my top 5 defunct Disney attractions I never got to experience. And if you'd like to check that out, then you can find the link to my page in the description. Other than that, if you're not already, please consider hitting subscribe, as there are always more videos about theme parks coming in the future. And as always, I'll see you next time.